So here I have a plot of neutron multiplication factor. What the hell is that? Versus time. Well, neutron multiplication factor is proportional to the number of fissions that are occurring. So at first critical, we start a chain reaction, a very slow chain reaction, a minimal chain reaction. As we force those atoms closer and closer together, the rate of fissioning increases, which is what the increase in this curve is indicating. And you will go in a fission in an implosion, the material will go together to a maximum compression, and then if it doesn't explode, it will just bounce apart on its own and go back down that dotted line where it says no initiation. So if you put neutrons in too soon, which is what I have here indicated with pre-initiation, you will start a fission reaction, which will produce heat, which will cause the assembly to disassemble and go down that sloping line next to the vertical line by the pre-initiation arrow. Now, the number of fissions per microsecond times length in time in microseconds is the total number of fissions. That's the yield. So the area under that little triangle is in fact the yield that you would get if you pre-initiated this system. If you initiated it with neutrons at peak criticality, at peak neutron multiplication factor, the area under this much bigger triangle is again the yield. Fissions per millionth of a second times that length of time in millionths of a second is the total number of fissions, the total yield. And so here you get a much larger triangle, a much larger yield. You get an explosion as opposed to a kind of a fizzle yield. So what does this mean? It means that a militarily useful first generation nuclear explosive that uses reactor grade plutonium, read that as Fat Man, can be designed to produce a nuclear yield in the multi-kiloton range. Whereas a first generation nuclear weapon, which is very large and unsophisticated, if it used weapons grade plutonium, the nominal yield would be about 20 kilotons. So with reactor grade plutonium, you would get a yield of at least a kiloton and more likely a number of kilotons more than that. And that relatively small yield would have a destructive radius greater than a third of that of the Hiroshima explosion. So to give you some idea here, here's a 15 kiloton detonation in the middle of Manhattan. And think about the damage that would occur with 1/3 of that radius that you're looking at there. A 1 kiloton explosion would be a significantly bad thing to have happen in a metropolitan area. So let me wrap this up. All plutonium isotopes can be used directly in nuclear explosives. In fact, in 1962, the United States tested a nuclear explosive made with reactor-grade plutonium. Thank you, it worked just fine. There is no such thing as denatured plutonium. And by that, I mean plutonium which is unsuitable for nuclear explosives. It simply does not exist. And high plutonium-240 content, isotope content in a nuclear weapon is simply an engineering complication. It's not an impediment to making a nuclear weapon. So again, I don't know that I need to repeat what the Department of Energy said in 1997. But a nuclear weapon with reactor-grade plutonium will produce a reliable yield of 1 or a few kilotons, and a most probable yield classified that is much higher than that. And an advanced nuclear weapons state, using weapons reactor-grade plutonium, can make explosives having reliable explosive yields, weights, and general characteristics comparable to weapons made from weapons-grade plutonium. And for those of you who might be interested, Henry, Victor Galinsky, and I wrote an editorial for the Tokyo Times about 5 years ago on commercial plutonium being a usable bomb material. And that website down below would allow you to see it in English. If you prefer the Japanese, you can also see that. And let me conclude here with some random thoughts. Prime Minister Sato of Japan is quoted as having argued privately that 3 weeks after a diet statement that he does not regard it as a complete system of defense if we cannot possess nuclear weapons in the era of nuclear weapons. 2 years later, Nakasone, then director of the Japan Defense Agency and a future prime minister, argued in a white paper that, in view of the danger of inviting adverse foreign reactions and large-scale foreign war, we will follow a policy of not acquiring nuclear weapons at present. Now, we've learned recently from the work of Veronica Gentilla that Japan is developing two A2AD defeating missiles. They are a scramjet hypersonic and a hypersonic glide vehicle, and they would be ideal for delivering a warhead, either conventional or otherwise, or nuclear. And when you put this together with Japan's 11 metric tons of reactor-grade plutonium in country, with the ability to deliver that warhead, that is a formidable latent nuclear weapons capability, especially for a technologically sophisticated country such as Japan.